As much time as we spent at those basketball games every day, probably I remember more about another rather novel event, at least for two guys from a western Kansas rural community. The Howard Hotel where we stayed was on 12th Street. It was on the south side of 12th Street, looking directly over 12th Street to what's known as the Follies. At that time, the Follies was well known far and wide all over the Midwest as a place where the dancing girls put on shows for clients that were brave enough to incur the social disdain of people who visited those places of disrepute. The interesting thing was the girls that were doing the performing would stand out on the streets with their feathers and their hats and their scanty attire, and they would try to attract customers in with their charm and wiles. Even more funny was the nature of the customers, because West 12th Street at the time really wasn't a very upscale part of Kansas City. In fact, most of the people walking down that street were winos, drunks, street people, and probably better described as gutter people. It was a real disarray of an unusual class of citizens, most of whom just stood outside the Follies and watched the girls, along with my dad and I, which were looking out the window of our hotel every night, watching the show. Unfortunately, they've torn down the Howard Hotel, and it no longer stands. But the Follies apparently deserved a much better future, because it's now a National Historical Site